Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and grab a blanket. Or two. Maybe even that weird medieval style goblet you bought on Etsy that you never actually use. Tonight, we're talking about royal mistresses. Now, if you're already imagining candlelit chambers, silk sheets, and dramatic secret rendezvous, slow down. That sounds exciting, which means it has no place here. This is a boring history for sleep. We're going to take that scandal and drag it through the mud of reality. Because honestly, most of this story is just awkward dinners, unpaid bills, and women who got ghosted by entire kingdoms. So the question is, what actually happened to these women when their royal sugar daddy, stopped being alive? Did they retire in luxury, get tossed out like last season's fashion, or end up in a convent praying for forgiveness for all the fun they had? Spoiler, the answer is yes to all of that, and sometimes much worse. Dim the lights. Put your phone on Do Not Disturb. And let's float back into a world of palaces, powdered wigs, and a very, very inconvenient death for the woman who thought she had it all figured out. If there's one place where the mistress scene wasn't just a thing, it was the thing. It's France. Specifically Versailles. This glittering gilded nightmare had more drama than a Bravo reality show, and about the same amount of dignity. Louis the Fond, the Sun King, the man who literally called himself the Sun because humility was clearly not trending, had mistresses the way modern influencers have brand deals. They were everywhere. But what happened when the sun set on Louis's love life? Take Louise de la Vallière. She was one of his early favorites, sweet, pious, allegedly pure as snow. Except for the part where she was having a very public affair with the most powerful man in Europe. Louise actually did something you'd never expect from a court mistress. She felt guilty, like Catholic guilt on steroids. When Louis got bored, and believe me, he did, Louise didn't pivot to another nobleman like some of her more practical peers. Nope. She went full I'm so sorry God mode and joined a convent. Picture that for a second. 1 minute you're dripping in diamonds, the next you're scrubbing floors and pretending you don't miss satin sheets. She actually became a Carmelite nun and outlived the king by decades, praying for the soul of the guy who ghosted her. So yes, that's one route. You can call it the extreme repentance package. But trust me, not everyone went that way. Now let's glide over to Madame de Montespan. She was Louise's replacement, and basically the Beyoncé of mistresses. Intelligent, gorgeous, ambitious. She didn't just have an affair with the king. She turned it into a career. Madame de Montespan was practically the CEO of being Louis's favorite. She hosted salons, manipulated politics, and made Versailles even cattier than usual. But here's the fun part. When Louis finally moved on, because apparently the sun needs to rise on new horizons, Montespan didn't exactly get a fairy tale ending. She was implicated in the affair of the poisons. Yes, that's a real thing. Basically, half of Paris was suddenly into black magic, love potions, and casual poisoning. Montespan allegedly dabbled in some of that to keep the king interested, which didn't work, by the way. She ended her life quietly in a convent too, except hers wasn't about deep guilt. It was more of a forced retirement plan. So if you're keeping score, 2 out of 2 mistresses so far ended up behind convent walls. God's basically the HR department for ex-mistresses at this point. Okay, let's say you've been listening to this while drifting off and thinking, surely some of these women walked away loaded, right? Yes, and no. Some did get lucky. If you can call spending your golden years fending off lawsuits lucky. Royal men often promise generous pensions, estates, jewels, basically the whole thank you for your service package. But courts were petty. Once the king was gone, his heirs usually swooped in like medieval repo men. Take Madame du Barry, mistress to Louis XV. She had beauty, charm, and the kind of wardrobe that could bankrupt small nations. When the old king kicked the bucket, de Barry's position collapsed faster than a poorly made powdered wig in the rain. She was banished from court and spent years trying to hang on to her wealth. Spoiler: it didn't end well. The French Revolution arrived and the revolutionaries were not big fans of Versailles alumni. Madame de Barry ended up losing her head. Literally. So yeah, if you're looking for a relaxing ending, don't look there. Across the channel, English Mistresses had a slightly different playbook. Less witchcraft, more passive-aggressive letters. Take Barbara Villiers, mistress of Charles II. Barbara was a lot. Extravagant, scandalous, allergic to modesty. She and Charles had a bunch of kids, which was awkward for everyone, especially the Queen. When Charles died, Barbara didn't exactly join a convent. She remarried multiple times, and she still managed to rack up debt like it was a competitive sport. In the end, she died broke, which feels like the moral of this entire story. Never assume the royal gravy train has unlimited gravy. Ah, but we're not done with the royal love game. Oh no. If the French and English courts had you thinking they were scandal central, just wait until we cross into Russia. Enter Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, who somehow managed to juggle empire building and a never-ending parade of lovers. Her personal life reads like a resume of intrigue. Generals, foreign diplomats, minor nobles, you name it. Each favorite had a brief but intense tenure, often ending with promotions, pensions, or discreet exits. Catherine's rule proved that sometimes political power and sexual politics were dangerously intertwined. Then there's Peter the Great, Catherine's predecessor, not exactly subtle in matters of desire. He reportedly had affairs that doubled as political alliances, showing that in Russia, love and power were rarely separate. And yes, the Russian court had its fair share of whispered rumors and plots, not to mention a taste for extravagant gifts that occasionally included estates or entire provinces. Moving southwest to Spain, where passion often collided with religious piety. Mistresses of the Habsburg and Bourbon kings weren't just beautiful distractions, they were players in dynastic maneuvering. Philip IV's court was a particularly juicy example. One of his famous mistresses, the beautiful Mariana of Austria, managed to influence politics indirectly, proving that behind every Spanish throne lurked a cunning woman with an agenda. And while Spanish kings might have been constrained by Catholic propriety, that didn't stop them from indulging in secret affairs, sometimes scandalously visible, sometimes buried in elaborate palace intrigue. And then, the Ottoman Empire, where the term mistress takes on a whole new meaning. The Sultan's harem was not just a collection of concubines. It was a carefully organized political institution. Women like Roxolana, Hurrem Sultan, could rise from captured slave to the most powerful woman in the empire, influencing policy, diplomacy, and succession. Unlike Europe, where mistresses were often tolerated but unofficial, Ottoman sultanas could wield real, tangible power behind the scenes, and sometimes openly, without apology. Across all these courts, a pattern emerges. Whether in Paris, London, Moscow, Madrid, or Constantinople, the most successful mistresses weren't just lovers. They were political operatives, cultural influencers, and, sometimes, architects of history itself. And as we move deeper into this exploration, we'll see just how much these women shaped the events we usually attribute only to kings, queens, and generals. Alright, grab your tea or your wine, because this is where things get delightfully messy. We're no longer talking about abstract courts had mistresses. We're talking real women with real influence. And yes, sometimes real venom. Take Anna Mons, a Dutch beauty who became the mistress of Peter the Great. She wasn't just pretty, she was a player. Peter supposedly adored her so much that he considered marriage. Well, he considered it until politics intervened. Anna's influence was enough that her brother gained power at court, a classic case of family perks courtesy of a royal crush. But as with many Russian tales, power was fleeting. Fall from favor meant sudden obscurity, or worse. Fast forward to Catherine the Great's era. Among her lovers, Grigory Potemkin deserves a special mention. He wasn't just a lover, he became arguably her partner in governance. Their bond blurred personal and political lines, illustrating that in Russia, mistresses could wield actual state power, not just charm. Rumor has it, Catherine even staged entire towns, Potemkin villages, to impress him. Love and propaganda all rolled into one. Now, Spain. Enter Mariana de Austria, the Habsburg queen. While she was technically queen, the court buzzed with talk of her intimate influence over King Philip IV. Spanish mistresses often had to navigate a tightrope. Enough visibility to gain favor, but enough discretion to avoid public scandal. And yet, some women manage both, secretly shaping policies, marriages, and succession. Not to mention, court intrigues often involved poisoned letters, clandestine meetings, and the occasional exile for rivals. Ah, the drama of 17th century Madrid. Then there's the legendary Roxolana, Hurrem Sultan. Captured as a slave and brought to the Sultan's harem, she not only captured his heart, but rewrote the rules of courtly power. She arranged marriages, advised on foreign policy, and even orchestrated the rise of her sons to succession. Rivalries were deadly. Another concubine or sultana could vanish from the harem overnight if she crossed Hurrem. And Hurrem, she survived, thrived, and changed the Ottoman succession forever. Across all three courts, you notice the same theme. Beauty alone was never enough. The most powerful mistresses combined charm with cunning, using their relationships as leverage to gain influence, wealth, and sometimes survival itself. Some were ruthless, some brilliant, all unforgettable. And just when you think you've heard it all, the next part will reveal the most shocking betrayals, rivalries, and coups inspired or directly executed by royal mistresses. Yes, it gets darker, juicier, and even more politically explosive. Ah, the sweet smell of scandal. If part 3 made you think mistresses were just charming women with influence, Part 4 will remind you, in the courts of Europe and the Ottoman Empire, love was often a weapon disguised as affection. Let's revisit Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's infamous mistress. She wasn't content with being pretty or witty. Oh no, she wanted supremacy. When rival mistresses threatened her position, rumors swirled that she allegedly dabbled in poison and black magic to eliminate competition. Court gossip exploded. Plots, secret letters, and even mysterious deaths were whispered to involve her. While history may exaggerate, the fear she inspired tells you everything about her power. Across the Channel, Barbara Villiers, mistress to Charles VI of England, mastered manipulation as a fine art. She influenced appointments, secured wealth, and even manipulated marriages for her allies and enemies alike. The king adored her, but her ambition sometimes made her dangerous, even to other courtiers who underestimated her cunning. Back in Russia, Catherine the Great's court wasn't free from lethal games. Some lovers fell out of favor and vanished quietly. Others were exiled under mysterious circumstances. The line between romance and political assassination was thin. Rumor has it that a certain general-turned-mistress favorite's death may have been accidental, but insiders whispered otherwise. Peter the Great himself set the tone. Love and politics often intertwined with high stakes and higher mortality rates. And we can't forget Hürrem Sultan, the woman who reshaped the empire. She orchestrated the removal of rivals, including the Sultan's other consorts, and even a few princes who threatened her son's succession. Her political maneuvers were as lethal as any battlefield campaign. In the harem, power wasn't just influence, it was survival. One misstep could mean imprisonment, exile, or execution. Hürrem navigated this lethal maze with remarkable skill, securing her family's position for generations. Spanish mistresses, too, played deadly games behind veils of religious piety. Poisoning rumors, secret alliances, and court intrigues weren't just gossip. They were tools of survival and ambition. Mariana of Austria's court was particularly notorious. Rivalries could end in exile, confiscation of property, or sudden disgrace. Behind closed doors, mistresses often ran as much of the political theatre as the kings themselves. Across all these empires, a pattern emerges. Love as leverage, charm as armor, cunning as survival. Mistresses weren't just companions. They were strategists, power brokers, and occasionally lethal players in the high-stakes chess game of monarchy. And just when you think it's all intrigue and betrayal, the final part will show the long-lasting impact of these women, how their influence shaped dynasties, policy, wars, and the very course of history. Because, believe it or not, the shadow of a mistress often stretches far beyond the bedroom. Okay, pull that blanket a little tighter, because now we're entering the sleepy realm of exceptions. The mistresses who somehow didn't end up in a convent, a prison, or a revolutionary chopping block. These women played the long game, sometimes quietly, sometimes cunningly, and occasionally with absurd luck. We touched on her briefly in part 2, but let's appreciate this story fully. Catherine Y started life as a maid, became Peter the Great's mistress, and, after much careful navigation of court intrigue, actually ascended to the throne as Empress of Russia. Imagine the paperwork. Or maybe don't, because you might fall asleep faster. Her story is the ultimate from zero to absolute power bedtime tale. She survived because she knew the right people, made the right alliances, and somehow convinced the court that she wasn't just a mistress, she was a ruler. Very few mistresses anywhere managed that. Hürrem Sultan, the legendary favorite of Suleiman the Magnificent, also survived the usual pitfalls of harem life. She wielded influence not just over her lover, but over the empire itself. After Suleiman's death, she ensured her children's positions were secure and continued to maneuver politically from behind the walls of the harem. The Ottoman system was unusual. Mistresses or consorts who played their cards right could live in wealth, comfort, and quiet power, without needing convents, pensions, or revolutions to decide their fate. It's a reminder that survival sometimes came down to patience, intelligence, and a carefully honed poker face. Across the channel, a few English mistresses managed to navigate life after royal death with, if not grace, at least strategy. Some remarried well, acquiring titles or estates, and managed to live out their days comfortably, though often still grappling with debts or scandalous reputations. Barbara Villiers, for example, didn't end up in a convent or executed, but she did spend her later years struggling financially despite multiple marriages. These stories are quieter, less dramatic, and therefore surprisingly sleep-friendly. They're about careful choices, social navigation, and sometimes sheer luck. The kind of historical how-to-survive guide that doesn't require guillotines or poison. All right, cozy listener, pull your blanket up. Maybe grab that lukewarm tea again, and let's slowly float toward the end. Because after hours of palace intrigue, convents, guillotines, and rare lucky escapes, it's time to consider what it all means. Across countries, centuries, and cultures, the lives of royal mistresses shared some sleepy consistencies. Royal favor is temporary. Kings, emperors, and sultans moved on, died, or were overthrown. No matter how dazzling a mistress appeared, her position was precarious. Retirement plans were unreliable. Pensions, estates, and promises often disappeared when the monarch died. Survival was as much about cunning and connections as beauty or charm. Convents, prisons, and exile were common post-mistress destinations. Sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced, always dull enough to put you to sleep. Rare exceptions existed. A few clever, patient, or lucky women, like Catherine Worshit or Hürrem Sultan, managed to transform favor into lasting influence. In other words, being a royal mistress was a high-stakes, low-security career. Glamorous, sometimes. Comfortable, occasionally. Safe, rarely. Sleepy, absolutely. If there's one takeaway to drift off with tonight, it's this. Power, love, and luxury are fleeting. Whether in Versailles, Moscow, Madrid, or Istanbul, history teaches us that no amount of silk, jewels, or whispered promises can guarantee comfort or longevity. The mistresses who survived did so by adapting, scheming quietly, and waiting for luck to smile. The ones who didn't, well, they make excellent bedtime tales, full of intrigue, caution, and mild horror, all in perfectly soporific doses. Imagine the palace corridors emptying, candles guttering, and the echoes of whispered plots fading into the night. Somewhere, a mistress might be scrubbing floors in a convent, another quietly writing letters on a sunlit balcony, and one lucky few sipping tea in a vast empty palace, having outlived kings and revolutions. History isn't always exciting. Often, it's just long, repetitive, and vaguely uncomfortable, like a half-forgotten dream you almost remember. But it's strangely comforting in its predictability. Good night, dear listener. Let the faint smell of old parchment, powdered wigs, and political intrigue lull you into sleep. All right, listeners, pull the blanket up to your chin, because some of these stories are unusual. Not gruesome like the guillotine tales, not horrifying like sudden exile, but just odd enough to make you drift into a calm, bemused sleep. Some mistresses decided to preserve their stories in writing. Madame de Maintenon, for example, started as a mistress to Louis XIV and eventually married him, very quietly, very unofficially. Later, she documented court life in letters and memoirs, giving historians an oddly boring but fascinating view into Versailles etiquette. Her writing style is calm, precise, and ideal for bedtime reading, unless you start worrying about court protocol in your dreams. Similarly, a few Spanish and Italian mistresses kept detailed correspondence about estate management, family arrangements, or scandalous gossip. Not dramatic enough to cause panic, but perfectly soporific. Some women turned retirement or exile into hobbies that were slightly strange. One Italian mistress spent years cataloging her wardrobe and organizing her jewels, writing inventories so meticulous that even accountants would yawn. Another French favorite devoted herself to horticulture, planting gardens that outlasted her palace intrigue. It's almost meditative. Gardens, inventories, letters, all safe, predictable, and guaranteed to make your eyelids heavy. A handful of mistresses simply survived by doing nothing. They faded into obscurity, outlived kings, and lived quietly in country estates, receiving occasional letters from heirs and forgetting court life altogether. These stories are almost anticlimactic, perfect for winding down your thoughts before sleep. Listeners, tuck in one last time. Imagine the palace corridors are silent now. Candles have guttered, fountains trickle faintly, and the echo of whispered court intrigues has faded to a dull hum. Across Europe, from Versailles to Moscow, Madrid to Istanbul, royal mistresses shared one fundamental truth. No matter the wealth, influence, or passion, life moves on. Kings die, empires shift, and favor evaporates like mist over a morning garden. If you've been half dozing through these stories, here's the sleepy moral: fleeting power. Influence is temporary, no matter how dazzling. Kings and sultans may adore you today, but tomorrow could bring exile, a convent, or worse. Adaptation is key. The few who survived did so by patience, clever alliances, and sometimes sheer luck. Flexibility in life is more reliable than any royal promise. Simplicity wins in the end. Some mistresses faded into obscurity, wrote letters, tended gardens, or quietly lived out their days. In history, boring can be blissful. Perhaps the most sleep-friendly thought is this: whether palace intrigue or ordinary life, human stories often end quietly. Glamour and scandal may dominate headlines or memoirs, but most of life even for kings and mistresses, is long, repetitive, and slightly mundane. And that, my dear listener, is perfectly okay. So as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine those palaces emptying. Mistresses scrubbing floors in convents, writing letters in sunlit rooms, counting jewels in distant estates, and somewhere, one lucky few resting comfortably, having outlived the chaos. The rest, like us, simply drift into history.